not just LA. If it was just LA, we'd have to wait 20 minutes because everybody's late here. But here we go. Welcome, everybody. I am Richard Greenberg. I'm the president of the Los Angeles OWASP chapter. Welcome to our first virtual event, obviously necessitated by the terrible things going on in the world today. Hopefully everybody who's joining us is safe. If anyone in your families or circle of friends does have issues, we hope that they are on the road to a quick recovery. So thank you for joining us, and we're going to get on our way with what should be a fantastic meeting. So if I can see here. There we go. Who is OWASP Los Angeles? So currently we're just short of 2,000 meetup members. So if you're listening and not a member, join us so we can hit that nice little milestone. We're one of the original host chapters of AppSec California, one of the most incredible conferences you will ever attend, typically held in January on the beach in Santa Monica. The view that you see at the top of the screen is from that venue. So it's not a bad place to have a conference. Hopefully, we will have it in January 2021, and you're all invited. We are a great community. We have great peer networking. OWASP is an organization with selfless people donating thousands of hours of sweat labor just for the cause, just so we have open source tools that can help us on the road to eventually secure code. There's tools, there are templates, there are sandboxes for you to learn and play with to improve, and there's frameworks that you could also use to implement at your organization to have a steady organizational approach to development. That includes security from phase 0, which is very important. OWASP LA meets monthly, anywhere from 70 to 90 of us in person. Do you guys remember in-person days? Wasn't that wonderful? We have free buffet dinner. It was nice, and hanging out with friends. We also have world-class speakers, such as we have today. There's our board of directors. We want to just let everyone know who's behind the scenes working hard to bring you these events. We've got a great team. I'm very honored to be associated with these folks. And you'll be seeing and hearing them if you come to our meetings in the future, or hopefully attend some of our future virtual meetings. Speaking of which, we have a very special guest at our next meeting, which is scheduled for May 27th at 11:45 as well. Many of you have heard the name Michael Howard of Microsoft fame. He's renowned in the field. He should be speaking on some fascinating topics. So make sure that if you are not on our meetup, that you join us, and then you can RSVP for that meeting. Michael, again, will surely get your interest. And we are very active on social media. We try to put some interesting information on there for you to learn. We've got Meetup, as I mentioned, just search for OWASP Los Angeles. We're on LinkedIn as a company page. We share a lot of interesting thoughts. We have Facebook for those of you who are over 30, and we have Instagram for those of you who are under 30. And we also are on Twitter, of course. So please do join us if you're on the phone and not seeing this. We're at OWASP LA on Twitter, and just search for OWASP LA on LinkedIn. And Instagram is at OWASP_LA. I guess we were just trying to be different there. Here's some advice for those of you cooped up in the house and would like to see some unbelievable content. All the talks, and I mean all of them, we had 4 concurrent sessions over 2 days from AppSec California. and they're all videoed on our YouTube channel. And you guys can see the entire conference, not all at once, unless you want to sit down with some salsa and chips one night and go through the entire conference. That would be great. But this is really good bedtime viewing. And some of the talks are just incredible. Here's the picture here is one of our keynotes, Alex Stamos, who I'm sure you're very familiar with. So he's available, and everyone, and all the OWASP AppSec California conferences 6 years prior are also on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. So there's something that you can do if you can't make a lot of the live events that are out there today because of something called work. So now, without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce the founder of OWASP Los Angeles, Cassio Goldschmidt, who's a colleague of mine for many years, a friend, and a leader in the field. He will introduce our speaker. So thank you very much.
Hey, Richard, thanks so much for the introduction. So in the last OWASP board meeting, we decided we cannot stop doing these meetings. And with COVID-19, there are a couple of things that really work on our side. One of them is that we had the ability not only to invite great speakers, but great speakers who are far away from Los Angeles, and we would have a really hard time getting them here. One great example is actually today's speaker. She is talking to us from New Zealand at 7 a.m. local time. Laura Bell is the co-founder, which is a company that helps business to develop and build systems, secure systems by design. She's a very seasoned security professional. She spoke at conferences such as Black Hat, Velocity, OSCON, QECOM, Microsoft TechEd, and she is the co-author of Agile Application Security, which is a book published by O'Reilly Media, and a regular writer of blogs and magazines. We're very honored to have her here in this very first experiment we're doing using online and streaming to you a talk. So Laura, without further ado.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. We're going to get this started today. All right. Okay, so before we begin, there's a few things we need to talk about. And that this isn't normal. This isn't the way we normally do meetups. And so there's a few things might happen in my environment or in your environment that are different to if you're sat in a lovely meetup room eating a buffet dinner. First thing, it's sunrise here. You will see the window change behind me. That's not a crazy effect. That's dawn. That's because it's autumn. Now, I also have children. While they are being looked after, you never know. You might get a guest appearance. If you hear birds, generally the world is waking up. Don't worry about any of these things. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about where you are right now. You can always come back to this later. You can watch the recording. What I want you to do is just relax. And my slides seem to want to do themselves, so we're just going to go with that. I'm going to talk to you today not just about application security vulnerabilities, but about how we think about security, especially in current times. I've reframed this talk. It was funny, I used to give this talk a couple of years ago, and it's changed. The world has changed. So just one note before I let this slide desperately move forward. You can find me online, Laura at safestack.io, or at lady_nerd on Twitter. Please tweet along if you like. Send me some messages. I'd love to hear your stories. And not just big organizations doing great things, but I work with a lot of tiny teams that are doing big things too. So if you're not in, the Netflixes of the world, don't worry. I actually love your stories too. So come share, come talk. The security of software depends on all of us, not just the big players. So that's me. Cassie gave me a great introduction, so I don't need to do any of this. My mom is very proud that I wrote a book. You don't need to worry about it too much. When the libraries reopen, I'm sure they'll have a copy. It has a bird on it. Who doesn't like birds? But what are we actually going to do today? Let's talk about that. We're going to talk a little about fear, and it's a bit of a timely place for the world right now to talk about that and the effect it's having on us and on how we're designing our systems. We're going to talk about the anti-patterns that come out when we build architectures around fear and how we learn to change this fear into a way to go really, really, really fast and build secure systems as we go. So the faster we go, the more opportunities we have. This is not the talk about, oh my God, the world is terrible, you should feel bad and perhaps rethink your life choices, become a plumber. It's not that talk. It's a talk about seeing some light in a dark situation and changing to look at behind us to go, oh, hey, we've survived before and we've learned to go fast before. So let's do that again. This isn't just about DevOps and all those kind of things. They're related. But there's some great speakers out there like Ian Coldwater who will have many lessons on that. So sit down, enjoy, have your cup of tea, whatever it is you're doing. I can't see you, so that's probably a blessing right now. And we'll get started. So let's start a little bit about fear. Now, the world is a pretty scary place right now, for many reasons, not just because of the medical situation we have in the world, but because of uncertainty. Big change brings with it uncertainty, and it is natural for that uncertainty to not just echo in the way that we live our lives, but also the way that we run our businesses and the way we build our applications. In fact, we've brought fear and uncertainty through into our application design for quite a long time. Now, the world can feel very bleak, and when the world is feeling bleak, especially if you're in a security space, you want to preserve safety. You try and control what you can, and so we can double down, if you will, on building the security into our systems. And what we don't mean is making them usable and safe for our users. What we mean is we feel safe in running them. And that's an important distinction. It's not about what is best for the end user at that case. It can just be that, how do I make my organization feel safe and secure? Now, the reality is for a number of businesses outside of pandemics and global recessions and all these terrible things, for many organizations, fear and risk and vulnerability is actually business as usual. So if you happen to work for a company that's small, maybe you're in a fast-growing startup, or somebody who's trying very hard to achieve something that's way bigger than they ever thought they would ever possibly achieve, then that fear is also there from that. It's not just about, somebody might steal my data. I'm going to be very candid. For some of our organizations, the biggest risk that they face isn't security. And that's a controversial opinion for a security person, right? I live and breathe this space. But if your company genuinely doesn't know if it's going to make payroll next month, they're not going to care too much about application security right now. They've got other problems. Now, this isn't saying we're not important. This is saying that we need to understand where we are in this context and how we can use that to enable people and make them feel safe, but in a different way than we would normally approach it, given that we're not the most important monster right now. Failing fast isn't a buzzword. Security, we know, can cause the failure of organizations. But if we look at the past few years, that's not actually what we see. What we see in application security breaches is there's press coverage, there's reputational damage, there's repercussions in the market, but very few companies actually fail. Another thing we don't like to talk about. We talk about the Equifaxes of the world. We talk about the big data breaches in medical. These organizations still exist. So we need to make sure that we understand when we're communicating that we're using the right language, not to say, hey, you're going to fail from this. But we can say, hey, but what if we're losing custom? What if we're gaining by doing good security? We're not talking about not failing. We're talking about succeeding more, that we're going to achieve more, get more custom, engage faster, have more performance, have higher quality. Now, security, like every other field, especially at the moment, is not a sprint. Nothing I'm suggesting here is going to be go to your organization tonight, switch it on, and you are fixed. I wish there was a big magic button to do that, and I'm sure a vendor will sell you one if you've got enough money. But it's a marathon made up of a million sprints. If you've been doing this a while, like me, you have the pit of despair after that first sprint where you go really, really, really hard. You find all of your problems that you need to fix. And then you stand on the precipice going, I need to fix all of these things, and realize that you're not looking over a flat landscape after this peak. You're looking at many peaks next where you find more things, where you dig further. One of the things I want to mention just at this point, especially given the modern circumstance, application security is hard at the best of times. And in a pandemic and in the cusp of a recession, it is critical that you look after yourself. So before we get into the controls and the architectures that I'm suggesting, the way I'd love you to think, I want you to take care of you. I want you to do a little bit of a self-assessment and make sure that you're achieving the security in your systems and your organizations because you care about that. That's good. You care deeply. But I don't want you to do it at the cost of your own personal burnout, fatigue, and stress. Because if you secure something for 5 minutes at full pace and then burn out, the rest of its life, and let's face it, most of our applications live for a startlingly long period of time online, much longer than we ever hoped they would. You're no good at that point. So please take care of you. Remember that as we're shifting our mindset away from fear and enclosed systems to being very fast and open, but very aware, that this is going to go for a long time. So you've got to be prepared for that long journey. I also want you to watch your language. Now, I'm British, sort of, and Kiwi, sort of. I'm a bit of a feral mix, and that's okay. But one of the things that I've been trying very hard to teach myself, and I'd love for you to do the same, is to look at your language, especially American folks. I love you, but you do it more than any other group that I know. If you're using these phrases, if you're talking about threat intelligence, kill chains, threat actors, if you sound like you've escaped from a 1988 Harrison Ford movie about the army, then you're doing it wrong. These words mean something to us. They have importance, but they're not the words that we need to use with our community, with our development teams, with our management people, because these words are fear-based military terms, and they invoke a really particular reaction in the people who hear them. And that reaction isn't, oh, I need to help you. It's, oh, hang on, what? That sounds painful. And sometimes pain is a good motivator, but sometimes actually it has the inverse of what we get. Well, the more scared we are, the more scared we get. It's a perpetuating cycle. And so even if your language is just layering up that fear, so if you talk about, threat intelligence, well, let's have a look, advanced persistent threat or cyber war, for example. Thankfully, we don't hear cyber war as much as we did 3 years ago. Phew, we're getting better. The words like war, threat, kill chain, they are all hitting little evolutionary triggers in us that make us think that we are physically at risk of harm. And that brings a little tiny bit of fear. And every tiny little bit of fear adds up. And the more scared we get, the more precautions we put in place that are not necessarily good for the job they're doing. Now, this is a quote from a group of amazing researchers. There's the name of the paper is at the bottom here. And they were doing research into the effect of fear and anger on the perceived risk of terrorism, which thankfully is not a problem we're talking about today, but it's another big threat situation. And what they found was the more people talked about it, the more scared they got. And the more scared they got, the more conservative they got in their risk estimates and plans. And so we basically had this self-perpetuating cycle of getting more and more cautious to the point where we slowed down and didn't do anything at all. Now, the thing is, not terrorism, not pandemics, not any of these things, but there are risks in every bit of our life. It's 6 a.m., 7 a.m. here. I have many things that could have hurt me by now. I could have choked on the water I'm drinking. I could have tripped over the Lego that's all over the floor in my children's bedroom. That's probably actually the bigger risk to me right now than COVID, because this place is like an obstacle course made for some kind of ninja warrior cat. Risk is everywhere, and if we let the overarching fear drive our security controls, then we will end up with very conservative security controls that hinder access rather than letting us go fast and increase our business or improve our situation or improve the experience for our users. You need to be very mindful that when we're planning our security controls, we're trying to shield our user behavior, we're trying to shape it. We can choose to make them fight. We want them to make good choices, fight on, let's try and make ourselves secure. We can get them to have flight, oh, this feels too risky, I need to leave right now. Or they can freeze in place and just be really horribly confused by the situation. We as security people who are governing and guiding application development, we are the guardians of this behavior. What we do will encourage people into one of these states, and this is a very human state. If a bear walked into your office right now, or wherever you're sat watching this, you would have a very instinctive response to one of these. And so we need to be mindful of how our architecture designs is choosing which one of these people end up in. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Now, before we talk about that, I just need to mention that we all come with a preset of things that we're already scared about. If you've worked for an organization that has been breached because of SQL injection, or that has had front page press coverage because there was a terrible event, maybe you weren't even involved in it, but your organization was, all of the things that were from that context will now trigger you to create the same behaviors and the same controls that you did back then. It's kind of a survival mechanism, if you will. Now, you need to be aware of that. You can't always build the same controls for the same systems just because you've experienced it before. Your context you're working in will have changed. So please be mindful of that, especially if, like me, you have a few silver knowledge sparkles in your hair. You know, we've been around the block a few times. We have to make sure that we're not building the same system every single time just because we have this scar tissue. So let's talk about some architecture anti-patterns, if you will. And these will all link to your vulnerabilities in your applications, but more to the structural components of how you build it all together. I'm not here to talk about the infrastructure. That's not my jam. I'm more of an application girl. But it's how we string together and how we think about them at that aggregated view. I'm going to talk about castles. Now, I'm British by heritage. I love castles. Castles are amazing. Any of you who watched Game of Thrones or any of these big fantasy TV shows, or you grew up on books about, you know, knights and castles and kingdoms and fantasy, then this will be your game, your jam. Now, castles, in their own way, much like we talk about onions a lot when we talk about network security, castles became one of our weird go-to allegories and metaphors for our software design. We have this big external wall, and we put our precious things into the middle, and that's where they live, and they're all safe and warm in there, like our treasure would be if it was an actual castle or a king or a queen. Now, the problem is, it's a really naive metaphor, and it's not a good pattern for our architecture. We can't just look at an external border as an external control, and that we're safe in the middle. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. Layered defenses like this create the expectation of safety that is managed by someone else. Now, I want you to kind of think about your context. Are you in one of those teams where people will say, hey, yeah, well, I know we need to do security, but we have a guy for that. We have a woman, yeah, that's that team. They do it over there. If you're in the environment where there is another group or another team or another control, such as a web application firewall, that's going to do the security, not us, then you've probably got some of the anti-patterns around castle design. You've got the idea that there is going to be the equivalent of Batman going to swoop in and do this for you. Now, defensive software architecture patterns don't just rely on this one either outsourced control or layered external defensive control, as many as you will know. But we need to make sure we think about it in a little bit more detail. In a normal room, I would have got this from the crowd, so you'd have been sat there happily thinking about castles. So maybe you can do that later, especially if you have kids and they're stuck at home. Getting them to think about castles is a really great way to get younger people thinking about how you defend something. And top tip, my toddler introduces Batman, dragons, and dinosaurs to the mix, so don't be limited by actual physics. Think about defenses as creatively as you like. Now, when we're looking at all of the defenses that are in a castle, you're seeing all sorts of things. So we've got the walls that we've talked about, that big defensive control at the end. We even have, you know, an army at the bottom there, which is our security team, if you will. Somebody else is going to take care of this problem for me. But we don't just have that at all. In fact, I ran out of space on this slide. We have dozens of controls. We have strong boxes, places to lock up things that are precious to us. We have signal fires to warn people far away that something bad is coming and you should probably watch out. We have things like murder holes, I didn't name them that, but where we had the idea that we could check that our guests were okay, and if we didn't like them much, we could, you know, murder them. I'm not suggesting murder, that's a crime, and crime is illegal in every country, not just in New Zealand. But all of our defenses lined up together. It was like some kind of crazy set of Avengers-style superhero tactics. Now, they weren't just all prevention either. Now, if we look at that list again and we color code them, we can see that actually our controls, even in castles, even though we're talking hundreds of years ago, our early defensive structures split their controls the same way we do our applications now. They did them in preventative, detective, and responsive controls. So our preventative controls, shown in the white here, are things like our walls and our vaults and our strong boxes. In the same way in our architectures, that is our borders, our firewalls. Our strong boxes are our secret stores, the places we keep the precious things. It's talking about, in our systems, it would be things like encryption. Now, detective controls in the blue here are how we notice that things were going wrong, just as we know in our architectures that detection of somebody exploiting a vulnerability is just as important as prevention, because we accept that we can't find all of the vulnerabilities in our software. It's just physically not possible. And so we also monitor for somebody seeing something that we haven't found. And finally, our purple. And these are our responsive controls now. Looking at these responsive controls, please don't take the lesson that it's okay to shoot people with arrows as a defense of your application. But there were a range here of defensive controls, including training people, including having an escape plan or an incident response plan, including having offensive capability. Now, we don't talk about offensive capability, and that's not appropriate for our applications in 99.9% of the cases. But that balance is important. Castles were not designed to be a big wall around a squishy or sensitive thing. They were designed to be the ultimate collection of coordinated defenses. I've split them there for you afterwards so you can have a look. Now you can look at any defensive structure you like, and you can take this exercise and you can practice it again. In fact, I'd love for you to go back to your environment, to your application environment, or to your organization and do the same thing. List what preventative controls that you have, what detective controls, and what responsive controls. And I don't mean just the ones that you touch, but the ones that are in your whole organization. If you work for a bank, go talk about bank controls. How would you prevent a bank robbery? If you work for a software company, then think about it in your context, because that process of seeing the many coordinated controls and splitting them into the categories is that remedy to the anti-pattern just believing in the border. In the UK, in England, we used to call border-driven security armadillo security. Or, well, maybe we didn't in the UK, maybe that's just me. But what I mean by this is armadillos, I don't know if you're familiar, cute little critters, hard shell, but if you flip them over, they've really tickly tummies. And they're really vulnerable on their underside. When we build our organizations, as we have done for 20, 30 years, with a hard network border, you're safe if you're inside our company, if you're inside our network, then we have the same vulnerability, especially as our architectures are changing. We'll come back to that. So what we want to do is make sure that to look at our architectures to prevent what we can, to detect it quickly, and to respond to it effectively and appropriately. And we all know that response in itself is its own category. You could do an entire talk on how effective and appropriate responses work. We need to assume compromise. Now, that isn't nihilistic. It's not saying, oh, the world is doomed and we shouldn't even try. What we're saying is go, okay, all right, sure, there's something bad happening here. If we know that, we plan our lives. If you know you live in a city or a state, well, you're in Los Angeles, so this is not going to work for you, but I live in New Zealand, we rain a lot. We get a lot of rain, especially in spring and in autumn. If you live here, you know that. You assume you're going to get wet, so you dress appropriately. It's the same way I assume if you've got anyone who lives in Seattle, where, you know, I visited, it seems very much the same kind of climate. We do this in our lives already with risks. We assume the risk is already there. We assume there's a risk you're going to get hurt in a car accident, so we put a seatbelt on. So we want to do the same thing in our systems. It shouldn't be a surprise that there's compromise. We're going to try and avoid it, but we're going to plan that it's there, because it's much easier to stop the argument and just get on with it. Defenses like this, and defenses in our organizations and in our application architecture, are involved in every bit of our system. So from deployment, through our integrations with other systems, through the deconstruction of our systems and our application architectures into components, and the distribution of our systems across geographic regions and hosting environments. Now, each of those areas provides its own set of challenges. We can't just rely on border controls if, for example, we are in a microservice architecture, because, well, we might have way more borders than you could possibly imagine. If your organization is integrated with a lot of partners for data aggregation and sharing, then you're going to find defenses in that space incredibly challenging. Any of you who've done much in threat modeling, and there's some really great threat modeling material out there in the OWASP space if you've not encountered it. And this links in nicely to the Application Security Verification Project. If you are not familiar with that, go check that out after this talk. And we talk about how systems that interact with us and connect into our applications can challenge our defenses and require us to think differently. Right, let's talk a little bit about gatekeepers, because as well as our border controls, we have the idea that there are gatekeepers that are going to keep us safe. Now, I updated this for a US audience. This is from one of your websites. I think it's a fairly strange infographic. I have no idea. I assume it's been photoshopped as it has Kitty on it. But we have the idea that there are border controls people, normally teams, that are going to protect us. Now, we have some of these in our physical space because we've learned and bad things have happened. But they're not always just there for the effectiveness of the check, but for the perception of that check once it happens. In a gatekeeper model, rather than in a layered defensive model, we say the border will protect us. There's a big wall. There is a security team. There is a firewall. There is something physically that will stop the bad thing from happening. In a gatekeeper model, we say, well, okay, hey user, you have to prove you are not malicious to continue here. And that's the difference. It's a different angle on this. So layered defenses stop the bad things happening. And in gatekeeper situations, you have to prove that you're good to continue. I don't know about you, but it's really hard to prove you're not malicious because I believe everyone has an equal opportunity to be malicious in every part of their life, whether you intend to be or whether you're just having a bad day. Owning up to my sins. Once upon a time, almost caused a severe road traffic accident, not because I was a bad driver, but because my daughter took off her shoe, unbeknownst to me, and put it out of the window, out of the back of the vehicle, and caused the cars behind us to swerve. I'm not a malicious person, but I caused and proved I had a threat right there. I had no way to prove that I was going to do that or not do that on a particular day. So when we put gatekeepers in place and we say, hey, user, prove that you're good to continue, we might be missing the point. A good person can't prove that they're good. And a bad person is really good at pretending they are. So we penalize and make systems less accessible to our good folk, the people who just want to get the job done. And all we do is give our attackers the opportunity to prove that they're very good at convincing us that they're legitimately supposed to be there. Now, we see this in crime as well. If anyone of you have ever read, there's some wonderful books out there about memory and about how crime works and how even just the questions you ask somebody will cue them up to say whether they committed a crime or not. And innocent people will say, yeah, I did a thing, just because of the way we set up the questions around them. Malicious people who are criminals, who have malicious intent against our systems, don't follow the rules. They will happily choose which rules they follow to get to their objective. Now, I'm not saying go do crime. My lawyer is very adamant. When I give talks, I say do not do crime. It's illegal. But I want you, if you know you're a good person, you go to church, you are part of your community, you've never committed a big crime, and I'm hoping you probably haven't because you have a lovely job and friends and things. If you're that person, I want you to give yourself an exercise here. I want you to go to a situation. I want you to think about maybe your organization or even your home. And I want you to think about how you would break the rules to commit a crime. Again, don't do it. That's the difference between criminality and curiosity, is action. But I want you to think about it. And in doing that, you start to see how difficult it is for an innocent person to prove that they didn't do these things. And how easy it is, if you look at the system in this way, to be flexible with the rules and to exploit our systems either for political, financial, or personal gain. Now let's have a look at this one. Now, I would normally ask in a room, who likes captures? And I'm not going to be able to ask today, so if you do secretly love captures, your secret is safe with us. But I hate them. That show my bias. I think they're an appalling check, but we feel like they make us safe. They make us feel safe because robots can't do this, right? We all know the thing we tell people when we design systems, put a capture in because it slows down the robots. The robots can't solve the capture, and then we can continue. But the truth is, neither can the humans. And this is an old style capture. Obviously, Google's moved on. Now Google is using us to train their AI self-driving algorithms and image recognition software. But still, for large groups of our population, these challenges are impossible to solve. Even with the audio mode, if you have visual impairment, if you have physical difficulties, if you have hearing difficulties, all of these things make our applications impenetrable. A good person cannot pass the gatekeeper. And if you're in that situation, so if you're building applications used by very broad demographics and not just very technically capable 20 to 35-year-olds, then you need to think about this. Are your gatekeeper controls actually keeping out the good and making it just a little bit of an annoyance for the bad? Which brings us nicely onto scar tissue. We all have a little bit of scar tissue in our systems. And the reason we have peanut notifications on peanuts is because at some point somebody sadly ate a pack of nuts and it contained a nut and they didn't realize there was a nut and they got sick or they died, and that's tragic and it's really awful. I'm not here to make a joke about that. But the labels we have on things, they are the repercussion of that. Scar tissue in our application security sense is the controls that we have in our applications because they were breached in a certain way before. Now, there's a gentleman called Adrian Cockcroft from the application performance and scaling space, who's not a security person. And I highly recommend you check out his talks. And in those talks, he talks about the policies in your company, like your HR policies, being the scar tissue of your company. So every time something's gone wrong with a person, you add a new line in the policy to say, hey, don't do that. And suddenly you end up with this giant list of all the things that could go wrong with people. Scar tissue in our applications is the same way. Now look at this beautiful example. Now this is a genuine password rules check. Now this came underneath the box where you typed your new password in. Now I love this because it shows me a lot of scar tissue for an organization. Sometimes the scar tissue is things like the length of passwords can't be over a certain length because it's written in 1987 COBOL and we're integrating naively in a middleware backend. If any of you are in banking, you feel your pain on that. It can't contain your net ID. We know that's going to happen anyway, but clearly they must have seen that before. But my favorite one is the last one, that little line of special characters that's on the screen. There is no logical reason at all why you need to refine and list specifically which special characters are allowed in a password, unless one very specific vulnerability has turned up in your application before. Now, I want you to have a think about that afterwards and see which special characters are missing from that list and what you could do with those special characters. Now, scar tissue in this case isn't an indication that they're very good at security. Security here is showing us that once upon a time, they were probably able to get cross-site scripting or SQL injection from a password field. Now, if you can get SQL injection or cross-site scripting from a password field, in New Zealand, we call this having a bigger problem. Now, at this point, yes, you have cross-site scripting and SQL injection, you should probably feel bad. But more importantly, what does it mean about your passwords? It means that at least somewhere in your system, they're in plain text. And the case is probably that you're either storing it in plain text or did store it in plain text, or it's been encrypted and decrypted to plain text at some point. Your scar tissue is not just making it very difficult as a gatekeeper to the users of your application. This is making choosing a good password almost impossible. But to an attacker, I read this with my attack mindset and I go, oh, okay, cool. So I know if I'm going to brute force this tool, I can only try passwords that are less than 16 and greater than 8. Wonderful. I've just increased the effectiveness of my brute forcing exponentially. Great. Because I've only got 8 character strings to try. Fab. I know that it needs to have one lowercase, so I can put that in my algorithm. And I know I don't need to bother with any of these special characters because they're not allowed. So in fact, our users got the bad end of the deal. They've got a bad day. And our attackers got a how-to guide of bypassing our authentication. Signs that you're in a defensive situation that is using scar tissue is nausea. Now, nausea is an acronym for not measurable. You can't prove that this is actually having a beneficial effect on your system in any way, shape, or form. It's acute, so oddly specific, like a list of special characters. Useless, yeah, in that case just then, it's actually making it a little easier for our attackers, not harder. Specific, like our set of rules, we know that from building systems and as the design community, that the more rules we have, the more likely we are to bypass all of them altogether and choose the simplest path. Exclusionary, so keeps people out, and arbitrary, doesn't really make any sense. Now this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek acronym, I just wanted to spell out nausea really, but it will make you remember this. If you're in the situation, you're looking at control and going, hey, does this make sense? Now, if you want a bit of a thought exercise, I want you to go back to your worlds and think about username enumeration. Now, we talk about this a lot. It's been in the OWASP Top 10 for many, many years, and we teach it to all of our application developers. I want you to think about our guidance for this, the standard stock guidance. And if you go and quiz a developer, I know when I talk to them, often the first thing they'll go, it's okay, we'll have a generic error message. The error message will say, we've sent you an email if you're registered. Now, I want you to think about, I'm not going to give you the answer in this talk, but you're welcome to tweet me or you're welcome to drop me a message. And I want you to answer the question for me. Why doesn't that generic error message work? Why is it scar tissue? and which parts of our application particularly doesn't it work for? And how's that making it easier for an attacker? Because our guidance on username enumeration is a wonderful example of scar tissue. So how do we overcome all of this? How do we make our lives awesome? How do we go faster without falling back on these anti-patterns we get from fear, from scar tissue, from the idea that a border or a gatekeeping system is going to save us? I want you to take a breath. Firstly, if you've been doing this a long time, or you work in critical systems, this will all feel really horrible to you because you kind of like the control. That's okay. But if you're not, if you've got the luxury of relaxing a little bit, of saying, okay, all right, maybe we can't stop everything, let's do something new, then this might be for you. I want us to move from the idea of castles to tiny houses. Now, I know there's a big fad around the world for these at the moment. They're really adorable, but if somebody who has children, it would never practically work. The idea of a tiny house is you have just what you need to get by. Simple, functional, focused systems. Now, our castles were very big. They were entire communities, almost like in our application sense, our monoliths. So if you're in a monolithic architecture, these are your castles, right? They are very complex sets of applications that function together to complete many functions. Our tiny houses are the digital equivalent of our microservices. Our microservices being that we have small autonomous bits of functionality. Each one is doing one job and one job well, so it's meeting that principle of single responsibility. Now, from a defensive point of view, if we bring this to application security, what do we need to understand? Well, it means that each one of those components, each one of those microservices has an opportunity to choose just the security controls it needs to get its job done. You can protect each one of these independently and autonomously, and as a function of them all working together, and then looking at the data connectivity between them, we become both more secure, but also more appropriate to the context each time. If we were to approach our security in the way we did our monolithic architectures, our monolithic applications, the way we do them into our microservices or our distributed systems now, we're going to overburden tiny, and I mean tiny, 6 or 7 lines of code with controls that make no sense, or that actually shields the fact that these applications may not work in the same way that they would have done 15 years ago. The other thing it gives us is the ability to not rely on our defenses working in every use case. Now imagine in this diagram here, what if those pink blobs weren't in our control at all? Maybe they're third-party integrations that we have with data sharing providers. We can't say to them, hey, here's our firewall, get behind it. That probably won't work. We can't say, here's our library, use it for your application calls and make sure you validate your input using our official scheme. But we can say, okay, right, these items, these ones that are outside our control, we can have little controls for those. We can make sure that the data validation on incoming calls is much more aggressive. We can have an assume compromised mentality and have trust but verify. So we trust you partners, but we're going to verify every single thing that you get sent to us. So no trusted access. Now that doesn't slow us down, that actually speeds us up, because if you just go, oh, okay, I just have to verify, then you verify everywhere. And so you take your architecture apart and you look at the tiny, simple controls for that particular part of it. Now, the challenge in this is when we look at monoliths, it's quite easy for us to look at the aggregated security risk of the system because it's all contained in one space. It's all in one place for us to rationalize. When we distribute it and go fast like this, it can be very easy for us to not see how some of the vulnerabilities in each of these individual components can work together. So do spend the extra time, not just looking at the individual components, but then at the aggregated piece and go, okay, right. Are there any points that where if a vulnerability in this component here and this one happen, that we've got extra things? So do spend that extra time on a check, looking at aggregated risk. Now, there are stories from our communities, from Ruby and the YAML bug 5 years ago, a number of places where we see these aggregated risks spring up. So low severity security vulnerabilities and multiple components that when they're looked at individually, don't seem like a problem, but when you look at them together, there's a risk. So please look at your components, choose the right controls for each of them, but then at some point, whether it's you or an architecture team or a group exercise, then go, okay, what if we put all of these things together? Where are the holes? The best controls you can have are small, frequently deployed, independent of other things, monitored and consistent, and they assume failure. Now, what I mean by this is don't try and over-engineer it. If you're a small company, you're a small team, and you don't have huge budget, you don't need to go out to a Black Hat or a big conference and spend $70,000 on a big shiny device to save all of your problems. if all you have access to is using the libraries and the standards and the frameworks that are out in the open source community, there's a lot you can do with small controls if they're consistently applied. Consistency is a much better use of our time than implementation of fancy gadgets. One of the most common causes of application vulnerabilities, in my experience, is applications that grow over time, so numbers of years, and inconsistent use of controls over that application suite. So as we've used new technologies, as we've used new frameworks, we haven't gone back and retrofitted our new controls in, or we haven't reviewed the controls in our older components and made sure that we're consistently responding. Also at risk are things that we just put together as an admin function or as a bit of functionality that's, oh, it's only for internal audiences. I don't know about you, if you've ever been on an application team where all of a sudden overnight, just completely theoretical situation here, obviously not taken from real world events, but you know, where your boss says, hey, the whole world suddenly has to work from home, so we're going to expose this application to the internet now. Let's say everyone caught a weird version of the flu. If that theoretically happened and we all had to work from home tomorrow and put all of our systems online, that lack of consistent approach on that bit of functionality that was only ever supposed to be used from, you know, one office block in one city by one person is suddenly exposing the entire organization. So we have to be consistent and assume that we're exposed, assume there's failure, so that if things change rapidly, as they do in the situation we're in now, that we're still protected. You also have to evaluate them and update them. Now, I want a little self-assessment. I'm going to raise my hand because I'll give my assessment out loud. If you've ever written a piece of code or planned a defense or done an architecture that you've looked at a year later and gone, oh my goodness, what is this? Was I having a bad day? I've definitely done that. You know, I started out writing radiation monitoring software at CERN. I was 22. There's no way on earth that the code I wrote when I was 22 would be fit for purpose today. And if that code is still there, I'm really sorry, Switzerland, if something goes wrong. But I want you to evaluate your security practice in the same way we would our application practice. So if you're a coder and a security person, update your methodologies and question them. If it doesn't work because you've moved to Node or Rust or whatever, then relook at it. And don't just look at it and go, well, you know, I'll look for official guidance. Why don't you come up with the guidance? If there's no guidance out there, help with it. We want to move from having gatekeepers to guardians. We want to look at ourselves not as the force to stop people getting in, but the protectors of what we have. Now, we have a big culture of this in New Zealand, of guardianship. We say we don't own the land, we don't own the water, we are the guardians of it. We don't try and keep people out, we try and protect what we have. Now, I want you to think about this as in your practice. You're not there to stop people. You're there to help them be safe. Now, there's meerkats on screen right now. Meerkats are great guardian species. They're a collaborative defender. Meerkats are the absolute opposite of how our security teams traditionally work. In meerkat society, when you are born, you automatically become part of the defense force. Everyone. There's no meerkat that gets to not do security. So our equivalent would be no developer, no technical member of our team. It gets away from security. There's no team to save the meerkats. They save themselves. And when they're young and when they're old, they spread across their territory, they review the situation, they have planned controls and planned responses. If they see a threat or a predator, they make a series of sounds, and those sounds vary based on the different predators they see, and they jump into their holes, or they have a planned incident response plan. They are the guardians of their own community, and they share the responsibility for it. If we plan our defenses as guardianship instead of gatekeeping, we invite our users in, but we invite them to be part of the solution for securing us. We encourage them to be more articulate if they see something wrong. We make them feel safe in reporting problems. We make our guidance to them easy to understand so that they have no doubt of how to behave in a sensible, secure way. We make ourselves open to the idea that we can share when we're learning things and when we are changing how we become the guardians of our environment. You're not Batman. You're not a superhero. You never will be. You don't want to be. You want to be a guardian. Batman was never a guardian. He was never able to protect the entirety of Gotham City. He only had to pick one thing he picked to fight with and hope that it worked. Guardians, particularly things like collaborative defenders, all work together and share that responsibility. And that means in our architectures, each team, if you've decomposed your architecture across teams, each team will have the autonomy to choose their own defenses and to explain to other teams how their defenses work, and then hopefully share those libraries and techniques so that people can all benefit from them. There should not be one team of 3 security engineers to 300 developers who are supposed to plan all the controls. They are there to support and be the guardians of the practice, to encourage and to make it safe for people to try and to fail. We want to move from things like our honeypots, our old situations where we would have, sorry, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I'm just going to get some water. We're going to get the idea that we're going to use things like honeypots and honey pits to create intentional vulnerabilities to learn about environments. And we're going to become guardians by using that knowledge and that intelligence to understand how attack works and what compromise would really look like. As an early indicator, now going back to our layer defenses, we said that our castles had signal fires. Well, our honeypots are a digital equivalent to a signal fire. They're another one of those controls we can put in place that give us an early warning. All of these things work together: good customer support, good engaged users, clear message, a honeypot to look for malicious activity. All of those combined are much, much stronger than relying on one monitoring and alert system or one overstretched on-call support member. I'm going to move from our scar tissue to our intelligent defenses. Now, intelligent defenses are about being context aware and protecting yourselves from the challenge of your own world. Now, I want you to challenge your own viewpoint. This is a picture of a Zorb. Now, New Zealand invented Zorbing, which is a weird thing for us to be famous for, but it's a nice thing to mention when I'm actually talking in Los Angeles. Now, it's a really strange sport. You throw yourself down a hill, a very steep hill, inside a giant bubble, sometimes filled with water just for added difficulty. Now, it's a really ridiculous thing to do. In the UK, they have an equivalent thing called the cheese race, where they go down a big hill chasing a block of cheese. That's a very British pastime. But they have no protective gear at all. And at the end of it, a lot of people get really badly hurt. Now, in New Zealand, we do the same thing without the cheese, but with a big bubble. Because you know why? We've got the same risks, big hills. We've got the same need to get down them very, very fast, but we want to enjoy the view on the way. So use your context. Use what you're trying to achieve and plan your controls based on it. If you want to have a beautiful experience going fast down a hill, then maybe the equivalent of a Zorb is for you. Now, in your applications, I also want to challenge your own view. If you know that you've built scar tissue in the past, if you know that if somebody asks you a question, they'll go, hey, we need to do this, then your response is, oh my goodness, this has failed before. Let's do the same thing again. If that scar tissue comes up, I want you to take a breath. And I want you to say, hey, okay, look, we have done this before because of these circumstances, but is this the same? Can we actually relax that? Was that control effective, or was that just a scar tissue piece for us? Build defenses that focus on usability and accessibility. Now, in current times, as we're facing down possibly recession, yeah, I'm not going to dance around that. Our applications, our organizations, our software, it is more important than ever that it is easy to use, that it is available to all of our users, because that's how our companies thrive and survive. They are not going to thrive and survive if we are difficult to use, difficult to understand. And so security can play a role in this. We can make our controls accessible and usable. We can look at them and go, okay, how else could we achieve the same level of control, of prevention or detection, but without stopping people? Now, if you've not done this before, find the UX people in your life, find the designers. They may not have ever spoken to a security person before. They might find you very confusing. But if you listen, they are normally able to really explain to you the flows that they see in their data through your applications and how your controls would affect that flow. And I'm a data nerd. I love seeing a good example of how data can show us what my controls did in terms of usability and accessibility. Make sure that you're adapting these regularly, because as people change, as technology changes, we need to adapt. Now look at the current world. We all went from systems that we used every now and again, like Zoom, to now we're all using it for 8 hours a day. In terms of usability and security, that was a hell of a learning curve, and they've had to go through a massive, massive review. I do not envy them. Every piece of software has the potential to be vulnerable. We shouldn't hold them up as a pariah because they got it wrong. We should look at them and go, how could that have been us? What could we learn while we're not in the spotlight that would stop us from having the same vulnerabilities? And we do this regularly, especially when the world changes. When we're looking at things like our password controls, examples that we love are things like this. It's not telling us the 27 rules they have to meet to pass validation. It's giving us a smiley face and saying, hey, you're doing a great job. The average human being spends less time choosing a password than they do choosing the socks they're going to wear today. Now, if you keep that in mind, don't try and make them think for 10 minutes on choosing a password. They won't do it. Either get rid of passwords entirely, and that's in another talk for another time, or give them things like this, where they get success, they get cheered on. You become their supporting guardian, helping them to be better, not penalizing them for not understanding your rules. Oh, okay, how are we all doing? I hope this has been interesting. I hope there's been some things for you to go and take away and take back to your world and to think about. I've given you a whole range of exercises you can go and think about in your architectures to spot those anti-patterns, things like relying heavily on their borders or single controls, like having gatekeepers that expect our good people to prove they're not evil, and scar tissue, which just basically makes it easier for our attackers to know what we did wrong last time, and how we can turn that actually into enabling applications to be more distributed, controls to be more specific, and hopefully our systems to go faster and be used more easily, which in the world we live in is hopefully the key to us all having happier existences in the coming years. If you have any questions, I believe they're all going into the chat channel, so please, do that. And they will be filtering and reading those. And if not, please find me online at the Twitters at lady_nerd. Please note, lady nerd without the underscore doesn't do security, and she doesn't really want your questions. She's lovely, so make sure you get the underscore in there, or drop me an email. I'd be happy to help if I can. Thank you very much for your time, and stay safe.
So we have one question, and that is, it sounds as if to be successful and follow the guidelines that you have shared with us, you need to engage upper management in your company and not just stay with your own team, right? You've got to share that and have lots of teams, correct?
Absolutely. And the upper management thing, especially right now, is really important. Your upper management right now are having a bad time, not for the same reasons you are. They're trying to understand how they survive, how they keep their staff, how they keep their team, how they meet their objectives. And so when they see us in our traditional role where we're there saying, hey, this is going to cost you money and this is going to be hard, and we do these old style patterns, it's really, really hard for them to support us right now because they have way bigger things to care about. If you are able to work with your senior leadership in whatever capacity that is, for smaller companies that will look different to the bigger ones, then you are able to go, right, yes, we have this risk, and we can still articulate risk in the same way we would before. But instead of saying, hey, we should stop, or hey, we should spend this amount of money, we can say, right, if we are able to do this, we could actually go faster. Or if we simplified here, we could do this more effectively. And we can reframe it to help them with their goals right now, which A, will get your company doing more innovative things, and B, will hopefully get a little bit more buy-in from a group of people who, it's not that they don't love you. I'm sure they love you, they hired you, but they have bigger problems right now. Any other questions?
Anyone else would like to type a few questions into the chat? I have one. I hadn't heard the term honey pit. Has that been around a while?
So honey pits were launched about 3 years ago at a conference. There was a big, so honeypots, I'll give you a little bit of background for those of you who may not have heard any of these terms before. Honeypots have been around, at least 15 years now. In fact, there was a wonderful open source project called the HoneyNet, where you could stand up servers, and there was like a global effort to understand how these attackers worked, and you would share the dumps, the forensic images of your boxes, and you would then be able to plan your defenses, because you could say, okay, of the 20 honeypots we looked at, almost always this pattern happened, and so we'd use it as intelligence sharing for planning our controls. Now, honey pits, there was a talk at KiwiCon and at some of the Australian conferences a couple of years ago, but I'll dig out links if people are interested. The idea that you intentionally create bits of functionality in your applications that it's not real, it's joke functionality, and you don't publicize it on your main page, you don't confuse your users. But if you're the type of attacker who's doing reconnaissance on an application and looking for something juicy to attack, and you're using all these reconnaissance tools that we're familiar with, things like Dirbuster and things, and you find this bit that says, super secret admin page, don't look at me, and maybe you might be a bit more subtle, but you get what I mean. Then the idea is you build this functionality to look like it's legitimate, and to get the attacker throwing all of their resources at it. They're going to throw their tools at it, go, all right, I'm going to try and bypass this authentication. I'm going to try and see if I can get some SQL injection in here. And they focus their energy and time on that bit of your application. You can put your monitoring heavily on that bit of functionality. And you can see, well, okay, how long did they spend here? When did they come? What time of day? What kind of tools did we see? Were we seeing the same people who came? Were there groups of them? Did they come back later? And it's kind of like having pest traps in your garden. If you put enough peanut butter down, you can find out how many rats and mice you have in your garden. It's our equivalent in our applications. So it's quite a fun way to understand if people really are going to try and attack your application. But there's a couple of things to note on it. If you're a big application, you've probably got a lot of people having a look anyway. So they'll probably work pretty quickly for you. If you're a smaller application, a smaller organization, these are super fun, but they've got to be interested in you to begin with. Now, I don't recommend you then advertise your honey pit out to the world and go, look, lol, secret functionality, shh, don't tell anyone. So don't invest in this if you don't think you're going to actually get people's attention to do it. Like, this is a defense you put in after you're already starting to see the credible signs that you've got enough publicity, enough market knowledge that they know you exist, and that you're starting to see, things like spikes in network scanning activity. So if you're using a lot of automated tools in your logs, then maybe this is the time for it. Other things to consider in parallel. So bug bounty programs would be a great precursor to this, because a bug bounty program is going to get people with semi-good intentions looking over your application first before you invite the randoms of the world to come in. I think there was another question there related to that.
Yeah, how do you create traffic for that?
That's the point. You can invite people in, you could put it on a bug bounty program and just stick it on the list. Mostly what you're looking for is organic traffic. So that these aren't aimed at, testing with a penetration tester. These are aimed at testing who turns up at your door. It's kind of like having a little camera at your front door. You don't know who's going to come, but you want to know when they did and what they did when they were there. So sometimes you might not get any traffic, and that's where the balance is. Don't invest heavily in this if you think the traffic isn't ever going to come. But if you want to do it, then good use of AI to make believable traffic. It's not about the traffic, because it's not about the calls. It's about what the attacker's doing when they're there. So you need a genuine attacker, because it needs to be genuine attack activity. What you want to do is you're basically tempting an attacker and going, hey, look, here's a juicy target. And then you're watching them. You're not stopping them. You're watching what they do on that bit of application functionality. But feel free to send through any more questions and things. And if you'd like, I'll try and find a little bit of an expert. There's a great lady called Kate Pierce. She's a CISO of a New Zealand equivalent of eBay called Trade Me. She did talk about it a couple of years ago. So I'll try and dig that out if it's useful to people.
A lot of your talk seemed to focus on good policies and approaches rather than just pure technology. Our field gets caught up in technology quite a bit. A lot of geeks work in here. And so I found that fascinating, and that's really instructive and very important. As a former CISO, I was focusing more on the policy and the process. Any last bit of advice for those who have not engaged the upper management or the other business units, and how they can really make inroads into resistance?
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to explain something, then I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm going to round it out. It's only a little bit of talking, don't worry. Firstly, you'll have noticed in my talk, I use lots of analogies and examples that have nothing to do with tech. I'm a very technical person. I've been doing it a very long time. But when you're communicating these things, our safest place, our easiest thing is to dive into the tech. Oh, it's this injection vulnerability, it's this. And we bring all of this engineer out. Our engineer is like a fire hose that hits other people in the face. What we want to do, however, is we need to communicate the message, and that's not the same thing. Now, to your point about needing to move past technology. Now, humans are jerks. Humans have always been jerks for as long as there have been humans. If we were all sat in a cave right now, and there was one valuable stone that was, sharper than the others, it was a great tool for cutting things and, cooking and hunting, then you could guarantee within 24 hours, at least one of you would have attacked another one to try and get that stone. It is wired into us, evolutionarily speaking, to survive. And to do that, we try and get whatever is valuable to us to get for ourselves. And it's how we've dominated as a species, to the detriment of many things, but either way. Now, all that's changed over time is that we don't have a sharp stone anymore. We have giant pots of information, or we have digital currencies. What's changed is the technology. Back then, we didn't try and hack each other. We sat in a cave. I'm sure it doesn't take much imagination to understand what we would have done to each other. We hit each other with heavy objects, and with tree stumps, and with rocks, and with our fists. Now, that hasn't changed. Information security is the same problem. We have something of value. We have technology that you can use to get access to it, and we have to defend. That is one of the oldest survival problems we have. So when you're looking at this outside of your bubble of engineering, as you're moving out to talk to stakeholders, to non-technical teams, to anyone in your world, remember that that instinct and understanding of risk is actually innate. They already understand this. They just don't understand your language. They don't understand the terminology you're using, but they understand the problem because they know how to protect what's precious to them. And they know that they have an instinct to gain the things that they need to survive. So when you're using all of this, don't be afraid of putting the engineer in you just to the back for a moment and taking a breath. It's not about undervaluing your contribution, and you're not patronizing people by telling stories. What you're doing is you're linking with them in language that they understand more instinctively so they can focus on the message. The less cognitive load, the less energy it takes somebody to understand what you're explaining, the more energy they have left to understand what they need to do next. So always bear that in mind. Make it easy to understand, because then they have much more energy left to help you with what you want to do. And it is in their instinct to help you. So hopefully that will help.
You know, one of the more interesting points that you made in what was really a great presentation, again, thank you, was that normal people make mistakes, but the black hat hackers, they don't make mistakes. They play by the rules, as you say. Interesting concept. We hadn't thought about it that way. So what can normal people do to address this?
Well, the first thing you can do is you need to take a step back, especially if you're defending, and learn something you knew. You knew this when you were a kid. Now, if any of you have children, you can do this experiment at home. Now, if I give you a device now, like a really high-end tablet, let's say an iPad, and I've said, hey, look, this is our cutting-edge technology. Would you like to have a look and try it out? You will all very politely, you'll hold it gently. You'll press the buttons one at a time, and you've got reverence. And that's because you understand physics and the cost and the law and reputation, and you're making all these decisions all at once, and you're following all of these rules and trying not to make a mistake. Now, if you give that to a child, now don't do this, don't give them an actual tablet, because I take no responsibility for what happens to your technology. But if you give them something and say, hey, look, take a look at this, they don't go, well, I'll just carefully press one button at a time. Like 1 in 10 children will do that. Most children will go, okay, cool. Right, I have 10 fingers and this has 3 buttons. I wonder what happens if I put 5 fingers and a toe on this iPad, what's going to happen? In the 80s, this is the generation of children who they were testing VHSs and then later DVD players by seeing if jam sandwiches played movies. We automatically have that creative kind of, what's the most we can do in this system? How can we bend those rules? As a child, that's how we learn about the world. But good people, moral people like ourselves, who don't do crime for a living, we filter that down and we train ourselves not to do it. We train ourselves to operate within the confines of the system. The people who succeed very well in either black hat hacking, either for good or evil, are the people who can understand the rules, but they can take a breath then and go, okay, that's great and all, but I can be flexible. So what I want you to do as your exercise, take a system, you could do it for your own home. I want you to look at an environment and I want you to free yourself up to use it in ways it wasn't expecting. Don't try and smash things that are valuable, and certainly don't do this on things you don't own or control, because again, that's illegal. But practice that thing you did as a kid. And if you need to remember it, go find children or people who are in the creative spaces. There is a team actually out there that to get help with this, they hire out-of-work script writers to help them do this, because creative people who write stories for a living, are very good at this. they respect that there's physics, they're just not governed by physics always applying in the same way to all people. So go and play. I'm a big proponent of play to get better at your defensive practice.
So Laura, did you have a good time in Southern California today?
It was unusually cold, but it's been great. I'm sure that you'll send around all of the wonderful, food and milkshakes and things that I've heard are a thing over there. I'm supposed to have gone and got a pink hot dog or something. I don't know. I did look it up earlier. I was like, oh my goodness, I really should probably visit there one day. So maybe instead I could just come visit maybe when the conferences are all back on.
Absolutely. And thanks for sharing a bit of New Zealand with us. And thank you for the references to the castles. I think that I'll be reviewing some documentaries with my daughter tonight about medieval castles. Thank you.
It's super fun way to do it. And good luck with that. And thank you everyone for making the time today. It was really great to meet you, albeit virtually, and please stay safe out there. It's challenging times, but I hope you're all safe, well, and continue to be so.
Same. Thanks.
So thank you. And thank you everybody on this call. And let's hope for a healthy, next few months here in what is really a difficult time. We'll see you all next month. Remember, we always meet on the 4th Wednesday of each month, and we have moved all our meetings to lunchtime to make your life easier. So we'll see you then. Laura, feel free to get up really early in the future and join our virtual meetings. And stay safe, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.